Okay, so we've had a pretty significant development. The Federal Trade Commission under the Trump administration has filed a lawsuit in federal court in the Northern District of Texas against the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH. FTC is alleging that WPATH violated the the FTC Act, specifically by engaging in deceptive practices in or affecting commerce. The Northern District of Texas is, of course, not a coincidental choice. It's a historically very friendly venue for Republicans. The judge assigned to this case is Mark Pittman, is a Trump appointee. The FTC likely wishes that the case had been assigned to a different judge, Judge Reed O'Connor, who has kind of made a name for himself issuing injunctions against Democratic policies and programs, Obamacare being one example. Reed O'Connor played a pretty aggressive role in striking down some of the Title IX regulations during the Obama years, especially. But in any case, it's a friendly venue, so it seems like the FTC should have at least initially some smooth sailing to get beyond the legal thresholds, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The FTC is joined by 4 states, Alaska, Iowa, Nebraska, and Texas, who are all alleging consumer protection violations under their own state laws. And if you're wondering, like I did, what gives a federal court in Texas the authority to interpret and apply state laws from other states, it's apparently something called supplemental jurisdiction. That basically just refers to the fact that if there are a number of different cases arising with the same set of facts, the same type of law, in order to increase efficiency, a federal court can hear all those cases consolidated. And so that concludes this evening's seminar on civil procedure. So very quickly, kind of why WPATH? What is WPATH? On its website, WPATH describes itself as a, quote, nonprofit interdisciplinary professional and educational association or organization devoted to transgender health. The website says WPATH members engage in academic research to develop evidence-based medicine and promote, quote, a high quality of care for trans-identified patients. The FTC is accusing WPATH of operating, quote, for the profit of its members by promoting the medical transition services that its members provide to children. So, these sound like different missions, one as represented by WPATH about itself, the other by FTC about WPATH. And naturally, a question arises as, okay, so which is it? Who's correct? And in a sense, it's both. Both are correct. WPATH leaders and its members certainly understand themselves to be promoting health for transgender people. But the FTC is saying that however WPATH understands its intentions, in practice, its actions have benefited its members financially. And that's very important because for WPATH to fall under the FTC's jurisdiction, the FTC will first have to show that WPATH has engaged in, and here I'm quoting from Section 5 of the FTC Act, quote, acts or practices in or affecting commerce. So I'd ask you to think about the FTC, to think about WPATH as the man behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz. The big question in this lawsuit is whether WPATH's lawyers will be successful in keeping that curtain shut. Of course, lawsuits are not just narrowly legal affairs. And I, as a non-lawyer with a political science background who studied courts and the policy process, I think of lawsuits as part of a complex, sometimes institution or multidisciplinary effort to bring about different policies or new social realities. And lawsuits are part of what's sometimes called lawfare. Lawfare refers to the use of legal concepts, legal threats, sometimes actual litigation to achieve social and political goals. And it can be successful even when a lawsuit fails. This phenomenon is sometimes known as winning by losing. In this case, critics of WPATH might hope that the very fact of an FTC lawsuit under the banner of fraud and consumer deception, regardless of its fate in court, will inspire more doctors, journalists, lawyers, politicians, activists, what have you, to wonder what's behind that curtain. And because anyone can look behind the curtain, even if the judge in this particular lawsuit cannot because of various institutional constraints, it's not hard to see how a lawsuit like this might prove to be very damaging to WPATH and by extension to the gender medicine field. Simply because more and more people will start to wonder, why is it that the FTC has filed this type of lawsuit? What really is behind that curtain? And for those of you who have been paying attention to this issue, and you know anything about the discovery from the Alabama lawsuit, Boe versus Marshall, primarily, but also other facts that have been, revealed about WPATH over the years, you know that there is something very, very significant behind that curtain. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we're facing here.
There's one thing you just said that I wanted to follow up on. You said for various legal reasons, the judge will not be able to see behind the curtain of the this is a little perplexing. Isn't the judge going to be exposed to everything that's been going on?
Yeah, so that is the question of the legal motions, the preliminary legal motions, because what the FTC has to show, and again, I'm not a lawyer, so you'll have to ask. I see Aaron is on the call. I'm sure there are other lawyers here who
Okay.
can explain this better than I can. But as a preliminary matter, the FTC is going to have to explain why the type of activity that is being challenged here, that is being questioned as potentially, deceptive, the FTC has to show that it falls under its jurisdiction because it's something that it either is commerce or it affects commerce. And there's of course a whole, I'm sure, a body of case law and various interpretations of case law. So I'm sure it's going to get very legally complicated. But if the FTC can't show that, if the WPATH's lawyers are successful in showing that the FTC has not managed to persuade that this is actions in or affecting commerce, then the case is not going to proceed.
Right, and in fact, this FTC complaint centers on the WPATH standards of care, and as I understand it, the FTC is complaining that in order to maintain and expand the market for transition services, that sounds like commerce, right? WPATH promotes these standards of care and represents them as evidence based. Are these evidence based standards of care?
Well, let's put a pin in the question of whether these are evidence-based standards of care, and just to kind of close the loop on the question of whether this falls under the FTC's jurisdiction. The FTC's specific claim here is not that WPATH itself engages directly in commerce. It's
Right.
a nonprofit after all, but rather that it facilitates commerce, meaning it expands. You could say it provides financial opportunities and increases financial opportunities for its members. That's the critical thing that the FTC is arguing here, and so the standards of care are the centerpiece of that that effort. But WPATH does other things too. You can find this in the FTC complaint, for example. It advises WPATH members on how to start, their own businesses in this
Oh,
space,
that sounds
and of
like
course,
commerce.
exactly right. So that is commerce. Now the question is, can WPATH be on the hook for that legally? And that's a question again for lawyers. I'm not
Okay.
I'm not an expert on that.
Um,
So that's the kind of stuff that's going to have to be argued at first.
Can you just tell us? I think some people in the audience may know already, but just remind us who are the members of WPATH? Are they all
Sure.
clinicians or researchers?
So WPATH membership is actually pretty professionally diverse. You have doctors, therapists, social workers, lawyers, researchers, and various kinds of activists. You don't have to be a doctor to be a WPATH member. Um, I couldn't tell you how many members WPATH has now, partly because they've taken down their member directory. I think the FTC mentions that in the complaint itself. But my guess would be, in the last few years, it's been every year in the low thousands, and that it's probably dwindling somewhat. But that's just a guess. I don't actually know. And then in terms of what WPATH offers to its members to get them to join, there's a number of incentives that it offers. One is, and I'm channeling my field of political science. One of them is what's known as solidary incentives. So that is, if you are a clinician and you want to commune with people who share a similar ideology or similar vision to you,
Mhm.
and meet them in conferences and so forth. They provide that. But more relevant to the FTC, Again, they can, they can really facilitate the professional growth of their members in ways that also result in financial remuneration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So they've got people who are not clinicians, which, and I don't know the degree to which the membership of, say, the American Academy of Pediatrics or the Endocrine Society or the, plastic whatever, have, large numbers of members that aren't clinicians, but this seems to be the case with WPATH, I guess.
Right, right. And keep in mind, WPATH is, well, yeah, I mean, we could talk about this in a moment, but in the United States, WPATH really was created to fill a, let's call it a professional void that came into being just kind of organically in this area, because gender medicine is fundamentally an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary field, right? It involves mental health, it involves surgery, it involves endocrinology. I think you could throw social work in there as well. And so WPATH, as opposed to these other organizations that you mentioned, the AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Endocrine Society, these are specialized groups that kind of take over a niche of medicine. WPATH claims to be multidisciplinary, and that is part of why it has successfully positioned itself as the preeminent authority. I'd say the other reason is because it claims to do more than just develop medical standards. WPATH very much has as its mission to promote a kind of a new cultural understanding of what it means to be transgender, what it means to live in a society like ours. Um, and it advocates for depathologizing gender incongruence, for example, and so on and so forth. And it does so in a way that's more, explicit, and you might even say aggressive than other organizations. Although other organizations have done that themselves. But in any case, that's kind of how WPATH has positioned itself. It's both as the cultural avant-garde of the transgender movement, but also as the only organization that truly embodies this multidisciplinary thing called gender medicine.
Right, and as you say, it got this sort of cultural patina, and but I would say maybe almost political, right, veneer to the thing. Um, what is the normal process for developing standards of care in a medical field? Could you tell us, and how did
Sure.
WPATH diverge from that?
Yeah. So, okay. So, I think we need to distinguish here between two separate concepts. Okay. One is clinical practice guideline, or I'll sometimes refer to them as medical recommendations, but let's just say those are the same thing.
Hmm.
And the other concept is standard of care. And these are distinct concepts. A clinical practice guideline is a set of medical recommendations for the treatment of a particular condition. In the language of evidence based medicine, the quality of a clinical practice guideline is referred to as its trustworthiness.
Hmm.
So, a trustworthy guideline is simply another way of saying a high quality guideline. Or it doesn't even have to be high quality, but it's good enough that it can inspire trust among clinicians and patients, and in this case, parents too. Um, and evidence-based medicine experts have developed various tools over the years, such as a tool called Appraisal of Guidelines for Research and Evaluation, that's AGREE, to assess the trustworthiness of a guideline according to certain pre-established criteria. And I should probably mention at this point that WPATH has failed that test when those types of tools have been applied to its standards of care version
So
8.
they've been found to be
Even
of not of high quality.
correct, correct. Um, the other concept that I mentioned is standard of care. And a standard of care is, at least in here, I'm talking about put this in the American context. A standard of care is actually a legal concept, or it's a medical legal concept. And it comes up typically in the context of medical malpractice lawsuits. So, doctors, let's say, who are accused of malpractice, defend themselves by claiming that they were doing what any reasonable doctor would do under the same circumstances. Or, in other words, they were following the accepted standard of care. And because the United States healthcare system is fragmented and
Mhm.
decentralized, we don't have a centralized authority like most European welfare states do. That's because we Americans have a long tradition of distrusting centralized government. For better or worse, we rely on litigation, on tort litigation in particular. We say, how are we going to make sure that doctors are held accountable and that deterred from, from practicing bad medicine, self-interested medicine, and so forth. Well, we're going to sue the bastards, right? We're going to give every American his or her day in court. That's the unique American way of doing everything. So now, let's circle back to WPATH. WPATH published Standards of Care version 8 in 2022. And again, it's the 8th version, right? And so this is an ongoing set of medical recommendations or guidelines, and it decided to call these medical recommendations the standards of care. And as the FTC points out, and I tend to agree, I don't think this is a coincidence. I think what WPATH seems to want to do here is to want to, convince courts in particular, and by extension, any institution that is affected by adjudication, by legal adjudication, to defer to it, meaning to WPATH, and its recommendations when adjudicating medical cases. So the choice of what to call its guideline can be very, very confusing to people. And again, I think that's intentional. It's intentionally confusing. If you compare that, for example, to the Endocrine Society, Endocrine Society does not call its guideline the standards of care. It just calls it clinical practice guideline, which is what it is.
So
So
standards,
anyway,
okay,
that's,
I
yeah.
want to make sure I understand this. Standards of care, and when you use that phrase, are you saying it carries greater legal weight?
Yes.
Okay, so as I recall that the malpractice case brought by the detransitioner Varian Fry,
Mhm.
right? I, if I'm recalling correctly, her lawyers argued that the clinicians treating her actually violated WPATH standards of care. That that he did. They actually
Yes.
flew in the right. So and successfully argued that, but they weren't questioning the validity of the standards of care. But that's a digression. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And I should also point out that, there have been cases that I've seen, for example, the case out of Multicare Health System in Washington, where, well, let me just back up one step. There's an understandable misperception. It's a misperception, but it's an understandable one among critics of WPATH that, the most controversial chapter in SOC 8 is the adolescent chapter. And there's this perception that, the adolescent chapter basically says, oh yeah, any kid who wants it, just give it to them, no problem, no questions asked. That's not what SOC 8 says. The adolescent chapter actually does contain some provisions about, mental health, doing assessments, trying to understand the relationship between mental health comorbid conditions, which are very common, and gender incongruence. It does, of course, however, say at the end of the day, yes, you should try to manage these or address these mental health conditions first, but don't let them be the reason why you're not giving the kid, hormones, right?
right,
So
right.
that it kind of speaks out of both sides of its mouth
Mhm.
here. But in any case, I forgot where I was going with this. Sorry, what was your question again?
Um, we were talking about the normal process for developing standards of care and whether or not WPATH standards of care deviates from the norm.
Right, right. Yeah, I'm sorry. I do remember where I was going with this, and that is just to say, um, there are cases where clinicians actually are saying, no, we're following WPATH, and therefore we think that this kid should not be on hormones right now because they have all these mental health challenges. And, their colleagues, and in the case of Multicare in Tacoma, the hospital itself said, no, no, ignore what SOC 8 says. If the kid wants it, you got to give it to him. But in terms of your question, the best way to do this is just to compare it to, for example, the Endocrine Society's guideline, which is a
Mhm.
very different creature. I mean, we'll get in a moment into how WPATH developed its SOC 8, which I think that's the meat of the story here. So let's get to that in a minute. But very quickly, just to kind of refer to the Endocrine Society, just so people understand. Um, the Endocrine Society has a guideline that it published in 2017. This was the second version of its clinical practice guideline. The first one came out in 2009. And there were a number of problems that have been identified with the Endocrine Society guideline. One is that, its authors are mostly WPATH members. They're almost all, I think, all gender clinicians, and they all have conflicts of interest, financial or at least intellectual. I shouldn't say at least, because intellectual can actually be more significant. So that's one type of violation, a deviation in this case from the standards announced by the National Academy of Medicine, or what it was called back then, the Institute of Medicine, and the World Health Organization. Both, as the standards of both say you cannot have a panel like that. Um, the second thing is that the Endocrine Society's guideline contains what are known as discordant recommendations, and some argue that they are inappropriate discordant recommendations. So a discordant recommendation is when you have a strong recommendation for treatment on the basis of acknowledged weak evidence. And
Yeah.
the Endocrine Society guideline, one of the ways, the clear ways in which it's distinct from the WPATH guideline, is that it acknowledges the low quality of evidence in the field, but it nevertheless makes pretty strong recommendations to administer treatment. And so, so that's known as a discordant recommendation if there's no justification. But if you actually look at the guideline, there is a justification. The justification that the Endocrine Society provides is contained in a statement called values and preferences. I won't get into the technicalities of why those statements matter in clinical practice guidelines, but it's enough to say that the Endocrine Society explicitly says we prioritize mental health above everything else. In second place, we put satisfying I'm paraphrasing, satisfying the embodiment goals, meaning the cosmetic desires of patients.
Aye.
And on the very bottom is avoiding harm.
Wow.
And so, because the evidence is very low for mental health benefits, the work that's being done here in the values and preference statement is the contrast between the middle tier, which is cosmetic desires, and the lower tier, which is avoiding harm. So de facto, it means that the Endocrine Society is saying, yeah, there's very little evidence for this, but because we prioritize letting kids achieve their cosmetic goals above avoiding any medical harm, any physical harm, we're going to make a strong recommendation to treat. So, if you ask an EBM, an evidence-based medicine purist, they'll say something like, look, they're being transparent about their values and preferences. You as a clinician are free to not use the clinical practice guideline. At least they're not deceiving you, right?
At least they're telling you that we have
Exactly.
a weak evidence base for this. However, we prioritize patient consumer satisfaction.
Right. Right.
Okay.
And so, yeah. And so that you could see how it's a very different kind of guideline from what WPATH has produced.
Um, don't all doctors want to make a living, want to make money? I mean, might there not be financial incentives in promoting any kind of, say, cosmetic surgery or all kinds of, people talked about, parents taking their kids into a pediatrician when the kid has an earache and the pediatrician feels pressure to write a prescription for an antibiotic, even though it's likely a viral infection. I mean, uh, but but when various medical associations are writing standards of care or guidelines, whatever it is, isn't there always in the back of their mind a financial incentive?
I think it's possible to be too cynical about this, if I'm going to be honest.
Okay.
I don't think that the WPATH members did this because they're trying to make money. And in fact, I think most people involved in gender medicine, with the exception of the surgeons, are among the lowest paid members of the profession. They do it because they are, in terms of their intentions, they're altruistic. They believe that they are benefiting a patient population that otherwise would be overlooked, that has desperate needs that are not being fulfilled. I think they see themselves, some of them certainly see themselves as kind of civil rights heroes to some extent. I think there's a lot of that in the field. But I don't think that most people go into this field in order to make money. And that includes the people who, I would say, most of the authors of Standards of Care version 8. But that's not to say that, if you are a gender surgeon, I won't name names, but there's a surgical center, a for-profit surgical center on the West Coast that has made quite a name for itself. I'm sure that the money is rolling in there. I have no doubt, um, because surgeries are extremely expensive. And if you can get insurance to pay for it, then you take away the incentive for patients to think twice or thrice before they choose to have them. But But in any case, you can definitely make a lot of money in surgery and potentially in endocrinology. I'm not an expert in kind of healthcare finance in that regard.
Well, in fact, the FCC did argue that WPATH misled practitioners and parents and children about the necessity, the safety, the scientific basis of these gender transition treatments, and with the goal of securing insurance coverage. Right.
Hmm. Hmm.
I mean, that's kind of what the FTC is arguing. They're what the financial. This is commerce. There was a financial motive, and they deceived
Right.
their customers. And I take it is the FTC arguing this was just deliberate deception?
Yes, I believe so, and I think that the evidence bears that out to some extent on some issues. Again, because you're talking about what people human psychology is very complicated. Sometimes people engage in motivated reasoning. Not me, of course. I'm never guilty of that. Sometimes people delude themselves about certain things. So to say deliberate deception, that's a pretty high bar, but you definitely see evidence of that in several very critical, I would say, places, and let's call it the WPATH record. So let's maybe pivot to talking about what exactly is behind that curtain, if that's okay.
Yes.
Um, and this, just kind of riffing off the FTC complaint, there are three sources of evidence that the FTC uses or relies on for its case. Just I think
Hmm.
it'll help to have a mental map of this. The first and most important comes from that Alabama lawsuit that I mentioned, Boe versus Marshall. I would characterize this as the smoking gun evidence of WPATH's misconduct, and
And this
because
was,
of
I'm sorry,
WPATH's,
Leor, this
Mhm.
came out in
Yeah.
discovery in that lawsuit, correct?
Correct. And I would say that because of WPATH's centrality to the field of gender medicine, certainly in the United States, to some extent in other countries, it kind of has ripple effects throughout other medical associations
Hmm.
and so forth. So that's where the most of the smoking gun evidence comes out of there. Um, and there, what you basically see is WPATH leaders, and especially the lead authors of Standards of Care 8, knowingly and deliberately committing scientific misconduct when drafting the standards, and then I think no less no less troublesome, conspiring to hide that misconduct, not just from the broader public and the medical community, but even in some cases from other WPATH members. And if
Oh.
you remind me later, I'll come back to that. But I think there's actually deception within WPATH, not just from WPATH. A second source of evidence in the complaint comes from comments that were submitted to the FTC over the past year in the context of its regulatory action. So in July of last year, the FTC held an event on the dangers of gender medicine, pediatric gender medicine, and a bunch of people spoke. I spoke at the event as well. And a few weeks later, they followed up with a request for submissions of comments from clinicians, from patients, patient advocates, parents,
Hmm.
you name it. Um, and so a lot of the comments that they received are from patients who were harmed or advocates of patients who were harmed. I presume that most, if not all of them, are detransitioners. But I try to distinguish between harmed patients and detransitioners because I think it's definitionally true in this field that every patient is harmed. The
Yeah.
question is whether there's a compensatory benefit. But anytime you disrupt, let's say, a teenage girl's endocrine system with 6 to 100 times the level of testosterone that's normal for her age, you're harming her no matter what else you do, even if you also benefit her. So everybody's harmed, but some people detransition, of course, and they're the ones mostly who submitted testimony.
Hmm.
So that's the second category. The third category, I think, is the most interesting and kind of clever or unexpected, and that is comments submitted by patients, clinicians, and advocates who support gender medicine, who support WPATH, and who are fiercely critical of the FTC. And what the FTC did here is citing these testimonials, it said, look, we're getting all these comments telling us that, WPATH tells us that gender affirming care is life saving and it's known to cause mental health benefits. And we relied on WPATH's representations and we're happy with the care that we got and so on and so forth. And the FTC is pointing to this and saying, you see,
You were
this
duped.
is the evidence.
You were
What's that?
duped. They're saying you
Well,
were
yeah,
duped.
Well, I mean, it's just in a more minimal sense. The FTC is pointing to these testimonies and saying, you see, this is evidence that people out there in the world actually do rely on WPATH, actually do listen to its guidance, and do make decisions about their medical care based on WPATH's outlook, based on its recommendations. And that's important because in a lawsuit like this, you have to be able to prove that people out there in the world actually rely in a material way on WPATH's recommendations. So and to some extent, all of these advocates of gender medicine may have actually helped the FTC in its lawsuit. We'll see. We'll see how that pans out.
Oh, that's
Okay, so with that in mind, let's zero in on the first category because that's really kind of the meat of
the
everything, right?
smoking gun.
Yeah, what came out of Alabama? And I could go on endlessly on this, but let me try to summarize it in a few categories. The first and maybe most explosive was the evidence that WPATH had commissioned systematic reviews of evidence from a methodologist at Johns Hopkins University. And then, after learning through private communication that those evidence reviews, including on adolescent outcomes, did not find good evidence that would support their medical approach, I think the way that one WPATH leader put it in an email is, "We were caught on the wrong foot by this information," right? We were caught on the wrong foot. That was the quote.
Wow.
They basically suppressed the publication of these evidence reviews. And we know that because the Johns Hopkins researchers complained in a private email to ARC, to a federal agency within HHS at the time, that the way they put it was WPATH is interfering with our ability to publish. And those reviews never saw the light of day. So we know that WPATH suppressed systematic reviews of evidence, and in evidence-based medicine, systematic reviews are the gold standards of evidence evaluation. They are what has allowed healthcare authorities in other countries to say, okay, you have all these studies that claim to find benefits from hormones, but but we need to actually look at first of all, the totality of evidence, not in cherry-picked studies, and second of all, at the underlying methodology of these studies to see if they're trustworthy. So it's the systematic reviews that have really turned things around in Europe
Mhm.
and forced healthcare authorities there to say, despite what everybody's saying about the studies, they actually don't show what's claimed. And so that's what WPATH had suppressed. And now comes the cover up. In SOC 8, WPATH writes in the adolescent chapter that a systematic review of evidence is, quote, not possible. And so you ask, like, is this deliberate deception? Well, Laura Edwards Leeper, who was one of the co-chairs of the adolescent chapter, told the journalist Jennifer Block in a documentary that Jennifer Block had produced a couple of years ago that they actually, that she at least didn't know about the suppression of evidence reviews. So I want to give people the benefit of the doubt here. It's at least possible that WPATH deceived members of SOC 8 with regard to what actually happened with the Johns Hopkins reviews.
Okay, so
Um,
let me just recap. You're saying
sure,
they've claimed that, well, a systematic review in this field is not possible, but they themselves had commissioned a systematic review. Johns
right.
Hopkins produced it, and they suppressed it. So this seems like a bold-faced lie to me.
Sure. Okay. I mean, you can certainly phrase it that way. In terms of what the FTC is concerned about, I think this is a pretty slam dunk example of deceptive practice. Let's put aside the question of whether it's a consumer practice. Um, but that's with regard to evidence reviews. Now, of course, the WPATH goes on to make strong recommendations in favor of treatment on the basis of weak evidence. It kind of made a mess with the whole grade system and didn't really use it as intended or at all. Um, but that's the first category, and I think to some extent the most troubling. The second has to do with age minimums, and there's a whole debacle about age minimums. This is what
Mhm.
appeared, for example, in the New York Times. For some reason, the New York Times has yet to report on kind of the full scandal here, the full kind of behind the curtains of what happened at WPATH. But at least with regard to age minimums, it did report. Um, and what happened there was that in the weeks leading up to publication of SOC 8, Admiral Rachel Levine, the Assistant Secretary for Health in the Biden Department of Health and Human Services, it looks from the record that Levine had promised WPATH leaders that the HHS, along with the White House, would help promote WPATH and its SOC 8 internationally and in the United States. And I think there was a kind of implicit understanding. This is me speculating, but I think there was an implicit understanding there that it would only do so if, if Levine got an advanced look at SOC 8 before it came out. So we know that Levine did get an advanced look, and Levine's secretary got in touch with WPATH leaders and said, look, we don't want there to be age minimums in there, because the draft at that point had, ages like 14 for hormones, 15 for, I think it was 15 for things like voice surgery, 16 for double mastectomy,
Good
17
Lord.
for vaginoplasty. Um, and so Levine's office wanted those age minimums taken out. Um, uh, because they would invite, I think, unwanted scrutiny and political backlash, right? For some reason, I think that the calculation was from HHS was, look, if we don't mention ages at all, that won't be as controversial as if we say, yes, 14 for hormones and 16 for double mastectomy. I don't know if that's a very politically prudent way to think about it, but that's how they were thinking about it. When WPATH leaders got this message, they were pretty outraged by it. One of them said, we have somebody who doesn't know anything about the field trying to meddle in our guideline. Yeah, I don't. One of them said, I don't know how I feel about letting U.S. politics dictate medical treatment. That's almost a direct quote, and more and more. I mean, there were quite a few of these quotes. Um, One of the problems was that the guidelines by this point had already gone through a consensus building process known as Delphi. I'm not going to get into the details, but Delphi is a structured consensus building process. It's usually used, but it's especially important when guideline developers don't rely on systematic reviews of evidence, because there's just more uncertainty in that case. And so the consensus matters more, if that makes sense. And these and the age minimums, the specified age minimums, had already gone through that process. And so the WPATH leaders kind of privately said to one another, "Look, we've already put it through that process. If we get rid of age minimums now, basically we either have to do that whole thing again, or we have to eliminate where we say it went through Delphi." And that's gonna undermine the trustworthiness of this guideline. Um, so things went on for a couple of weeks, and then what ended up tipping the balance in favor of Levine's request was that when WPATH sent its Standards of Care 8 to a bunch of medical associations asking them to endorse SOC 8, and by the way, none of them did, but the AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics, came back and said, again in a private email, we're not going to endorse this, and in fact, we're going to publicly oppose SOC 8 if you don't take out the age minimums.
This was
Now, I
the
think
American Academy of Pediatrics?
correct. And AAP, from what I remember, and I didn't have to jog my memory here, but from what I remember, AAP had a slightly different rationale. I think they either weren't sure that they wanted surgeries to be recommended for minors, or I think more likely they wanted it to be a very, what they like to call an individualized approach, where it's on a case by case determination without any kind of standards or recommendations with regard to ages. Regardless, AAP said take out the age minimums, or we're going to publicly oppose this. And of course, that would have been fatal for WPATH's
Wait.
efforts.
Sorry. AAP said take out the age minimums, or we
Correct.
oppose it?
Correct. They wanted WPATH to eliminate all age minimums from the adolescent
So it wasn't
recommendations.
just Rachel Levine's idea. It was actually the AAP as well.
Both of them, each for their own reasons, pressured WPATH to eliminate age minimums. And it was the AAP's pressure that tipped the scales, because here you have a bona fide medical group, presiding over the field of pediatrics, saying we will publicly oppose you. And so that settled the matter. And once again, WPATH leaders privately complained about this. In fact, there's a very damning email by, I think was it Eli Coleman? I can't remember, but one of the SOC 8 leaders saying, the AAP, they're just a bunch of amateurs. They all think alike. Their policy statement from 2018 sucks, and so on and so forth. But hey, you know what? We got to give in here. And so that's what they did. But, and this is critical, they never got rid of the Delphi statement in the final published version.
Oh,
So
so
if you
It is as if it had gone through this consensus process when in
Right.
fact the conclusion ran counter to that. The,
Correct. So within hours of SOC 8 being published in September of 2022, the AAP, sorry, the WPATH issued an erratum in its journal where SOC 8 was
Mhm.
published, eliminating the age minimums. It then issued another erratum, erasing the first erratum. I don't know why it did that. Maybe to cover its tracks. I don't know. It's kind of weird, but in any case, they within hours they eliminated the age minimums, but they didn't touch the Delphi statement. And we know this partly because Eli Coleman, the lead, the chair of the SOC 8 committee, said this in the deposition, that the new recommendations without age minimums never went through Delphi, even though it's represented that they did. And this is serious because if you are a clinician who cares about consensus as kind of a source of trustworthiness for medical recommendations, even if you're a gender clinician who, or I should say, especially if you're a gender clinician who is sympathetic to WPATH, you've been misled, and you in turn are misleading your patients. So that's the second category of stuff, the age
wow.
minimum, stuff. And the third category would be the conflicts of interest. Um, there are pretty rigorous standards for how to define and manage conflicts of interest that have been specified in the National Academy of Medicine and the WHO, the World Health Organization, for
Excuse me.
guideline
This would be
developers.
conflicts of interest on the part of those who are writing the standards of care or guidelines.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, and you can easily see why, right? I mean, if doctors stand to benefit personally or professionally, or financially, they obviously have a conflict of interest. But they could also have intellectual conflicts of interest if, for example, they have been, in the trenches, advocating for a certain procedure and putting their name to these arguments and publishing and engaging in debate and so on and so forth. They'd have to admit that they were wrong, right? So nobody likes to admit that they're wrong. So there are intellectual conflicts of interest as well. But in any case, um, the National Academy of Medicine and World Health Organization say that conflicts of interest should be pretty seriously managed in these situations. Normally, you would have, well, I should say, ideally, you would have people without conflicts of interest writing these recommendations, and as needed, consulting with subject area experts who might have conflicts, but keeping them at bay. Um, it just so happens that in these niche areas of medicine, where you don't have many experts and it's a relatively new field, it's very difficult to do that. And so de facto, you do need to have more involvement from people who have COIs or conflicts of interest. But that's all the more reason why you have to be very diligent about disclosure and management. Management could mean something like, for example, for every Johanna Olsen Kennedy, somebody who's very aggressively pro-affirming and no gatekeeping, you have a Ken Zucker, for example, right? Somebody who is a lot more cautious, a lot more circumspect, research grounded, and so forth. But they didn't do that. In fact, they did exactly the opposite. And this again came out in depositions, and in the Alabama discovery. What they did was they had basically a litmus test that only clinicians who were affirming, meaning who supported the kind of lowered gatekeeping slash minimal gatekeeping model, were invited to participate in the process. There were a few standouts, Laura Edwards Leeper being one of them. But for the most part, that was the litmus test. Um, and what's interesting is that they write in SOC 8, they write in the conflict of interest disclosure section towards the end, they write there were no significant conflicts of interest. And that's just clearly false. We know it's false for two reasons. Number one, because WPATH employed the same methodologists from Johns Hopkins who were supposed to do the systematic reviews. They were also employed as advisors to the whole SOC 8 development process. And that's important because you need to have this kind of external authority to keep you honest. And we see from the emails that were revealed in that case that the Johns Hopkins people wrote to WPATH and said, you needed to do conflict of interest management before you recruited people and started writing the guideline, not after. And this was not done correctly, and you're not in compliance with the standards here. And they just shrugged that off. And we also know from the deposition of Eli Coleman that the word he used was most authors of SOC 8 had conflicts of interest, unmanaged conflicts of interest. So that's a pretty significant misrepresentation. If most of them had conflicts that clearly violate the NAM and WHO standards, and yet WPATH explicitly says we followed NAM and WHO standards for defining and managing conflicts of interest, that's deception, plain and simple.
Well,
Whatever else you want to call it.
this kind of reminds me of this mantra that we heard from the WPATH people, when and their supporters, when Dr. Cass came out with her review, which was, well, what does she know about this field? She's just a run-of-the-mill pediatrician. She's
Mm, mhm,
not a gender clinician herself. She hasn't personally uh, treated these patients.
mhm,
And they were presenting what you and I or someone else might say is a conflict of interest if you're so deeply
mhm,
invested in a certain model of care, as a deficiency, as a
mhm.
lack of knowledge, right? So
Yeah, that's right. And this is a very good example of how I think there's a systemic difference here between the US and the UK. If you look at the Cass review, the opening of the Cass review, they actually explicitly acknowledge that. And they say Dr. Cass was chosen precisely because she's not personally involved in this area of medicine and therefore has fewer or no conflicts of interest. But in the United States, given how our health, I think this is a systemic issue more than anything else, given how our health system works. The lack of centralized authority means that de facto it's the doctor organizations, independent kind of civil society actors and entities who define the standard of care, medical recommendations and the standard of
which
care.
and one could argue that those professional medical societies to a certain degree operate as trade associations.
Sure. Oh, no, of course they do. And in fact, not only could one argue, I have argued that in the Wall Street Journal, and I stand by it. I think that's it's correct. And there's multiple books that have been written, academic works that look at this problem and all of its implications. But here, all I'm just saying is, um, in this kind of decentralized and fragmented system, you can see how easily there's kind of these norms of professional deference and fiefdoms and kind of guarding your
Mm.
fiefdom, where if you are a gender clinician, then nobody else but you should be writing the recommendations, and so on and so forth for all other types of medical treatments too, not just in the area of gender. So I think it's a systemic difference between the UK and the United States. But in any
Right.
case, the last thing that I'll mention, and there's of course a lot more in the Alabama disclosure, but the fourth and last thing I'll mention is this whole thing about medical necessity. Medical necessity in American healthcare regulation is a pretty distinct term with a pretty distinct definition. Different states, if you look at state Medicaid definitions, there's some variation, but more or less they all agree that there has to be solid evidence for benefit. And moreover, there has to be evidence that the benefit outweighs harm. Um, and that, of course, doesn't exist in the field of gender medicine, adult or pediatrics, but especially not pediatrics. WPATH, there are several statements that were unsealed in the Alabama documents that were, WPATH folks openly say things like, we know that there are gaps in the research. I think Eli Coleman said that there are gaps in the research. That's the diplomatic way of saying there's no good evidence. Um, they say things like, if we make statements about the evidence, SEGM, the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, will tear us to shreds and things like that. So they're well aware of the problems of evidence in the field. Um,
Well,
and
couldn't you
so,
argue that the fact that they have said, well, we know there's, maybe thin evidence, but um, our driving force is the desire to make the patient happy, right? That's
yeah, they don't say it in those words,
that's
but that is, yes, that's
not
the ethos.
medically necessary.
That's the ethos. But look, the medical necessity stuff is I would say 90% about insurance, right? And that also was said explicitly in those emails. You had people like Dan Karasik, a psychiatrist, a very well-known WPATH person, basically encouraging his colleagues to sprinkle in medical necessity statements anywhere they could to make sure that the recommended treatments would also be covered by insurance. And this is, I think, one of the hooks that the FTC will have on WPATH is that. As a matter of fact, commercial entities like Cigna Insurance and Aetna Insurance and state Medicaid authorities, I think most notable of all, Oregon, have adopted WPATH standards of care for determining coverage benefits. So it
Mm,
was a very successful operation. Of course, it relied on other exogenous actors like the Human Rights Campaign with their Health Equality Index creates powerful incentives, corporate equality index, powerful incentives for hospitals and corporations like insurance companies to adopt WPATH. So there's a whole kind of ecosystem that creates these incentives for SOC8s to be implemented across U.S. healthcare settings. But that's the reality. That's what ended up happening, and the medical necessity statements are of central importance to that. They're also important in the context of lawsuits. Because if you have states passing laws imposing age minimums on access to hormones and surgeries,
right.
then advocates of gender medicine argue that this is unconstitutional because you're depriving people of medically necessary treatments. And if all the major medical groups submit amicus briefs, as they did, citing WPATH standards of care and the Endocrine Society, then a lay judge who has not done a deep dive into this topic, you can see why that judge would say, okay, I have Republicans on one side and the entire medical community, as I understand it, as represented by medical associations, saying that these treatments are medically necessary and in fact life-saving. And so WPATH SOC8 developers consciously and deliberately included medical necessity statements with the hope and intent that they would shape insurance and legal outcomes. And they said that openly. That was not implied. It was said explicitly.
Okay, so they're arguing we need to show that or assert that these treatments are medically necessary in order to get insurance. And I guess the FTC will argue, well, you may be asserting that they're medically necessary, but you knew darn well that the evidence was very thin.
Yeah, I don't think this lawsuit is really going to be about that. Again, the legal fight here is going to be: does the FTC have jurisdiction over WPATH? WPATH is going to be arguing that this is just, First Amendment protected speech,
Right.
that its activities do not rise to the level of commerce, that it does nothing but educate. And I believe there's a Supreme Court precedent that they're going to be citing. I haven't looked at it. I don't know what it says, but I've spoken to uh, a couple lawyers who know a lot more than I do about this, and they
Yeah.
they seem pretty confident that the district court in Texas, at least, is going to allow the FTC to proceed. But who knows? Your guess is as good as mine.
Well, I was going to ask you if you expected this lawsuit to hold up in court.
So I guess my short answer is, if FTC gets past those initial legal thresholds, I don't see how WPATH comes out of this not battered and bruised at minimum, if not demolished. I think that the more interesting question is going to be what happens to other medical groups.
I was going to
Um,
ask,
b-
I
yeah.
mean, first of all, could the FTC go after the American Academy of Pediatrics or the Endocrine
Mhm.
Society? Or would they just see a WPATH, these other societies see WPATH going up in flames and think, okay, we better pull back from this whole business?
Yeah. There's going to be more involved here in answering that question than just what the FTC wants, because I think if the FTC gets a favorable verdict, or even if the trial proceeds to a point where it kind of becomes public knowledge what WPATH did, and it's no longer easy to confine this to a few conservative newspapers and the occasional New York Times or the Atlantic or Washington Post mention here or there. If it really becomes kind of front page news, um, that's going to be, you don't need the FTC anymore. And in fact, I've long argued that the only way to get to depoliticize this issue and get the Republicans off the backs of the gender medicine field is for the kind of epistemic gatekeepers of liberal America, whether it's New York Times, academia, the major medical news outlets, MedPage Today, and so forth, to simply look at gender medicine from the ground up, to understand the fields, to look behind the curtain, as I've been saying. I think that would be more than enough to really start a change of course within the field, and because that's what's happened in other countries, right? It's just that because we don't have the centralized healthcare system that Finland and Sweden have, for example, we rely on private entities, and if the private entities are not going to do their job in that regard, it falls to Republicans, and they're going to be bulls in a china shop. Of course they are. They're going to overcorrect. So in any case, that's kind of where I see things going. But with regard specifically to the AAP and the Endocrine Society, I guess what I would say is the AAP it's not as clear that the AAP would be on the hook, even though its 2018 policy statement is an absolute disaster of representing research. I mean, there are two authoritative peer-reviewed fact checks of the AAP statement that are just devastating, right? One by James Cantor and the other by Kathleen McDevitt, that showed that the AAP just completely misrepresented the research. Its own citations sometimes say the exact opposite of what it says in its policy statement. I mean, it really is a scientific misconduct of the first degree. But at the same time, the AAP does not make medical recommendations. This is a policy statement. It's kind of a general statement of aspiration. And the AAP says, if you want to know what the medical recommendations here are, read WPATH. Back then it was SOC 7, and and the Endocrine Society, because those are the medical guidelines. With the Endocrine Society, the problems that I listed earlier apply, right? So it's a different ballgame for the FTC to go after Endocrine Society, because the Endocrine Society was to some extent more transparent, quite a bit more transparent. I mean, I don't think it's anywhere close to the level of scandal. I think the scandal in the Endocrine Society is hiding in plain sight, right? It's that values and preferences statement where they openly say we are prioritizing letting adolescents achieve their cosmetic goals over avoiding harm. So I could see a situation where
Sounding.
Endocrine Society says, "Look, we said so transparently. We're not deceiving anyone. If somebody misrepresented our guideline and obscured that very important passage, then that's on them, not on us."
Well, when you were just mentioning that the American Academy of Pediatrics would then refer to the WPATH guidelines, I was reminded of what Dr. Ass singled out, this circularity of consent
Yeah.
that she said, where there's this impression that gee, oh, and you hear this from the advocates of these interventions, that all the major medical societies support these interventions, but she was suggesting they're all going back to they're all quoting each
Mhm.
other, yeah, rather than
That's right.
conducting their own independent studies and arriving at the same conclusion.
That's right. So Cass said two things. She said that they are linked by co-sponsorship, right? Um,
Yeah.
so it's basically like the same authors writing the same recommendations, and I refer to this as WPATH laundering, because WPATH is pretty explicitly an activist organization, and it's been historically very important to WPATH to have major bona fide medical groups support its approach, either by issuing their own recommendations or by endorsing WPATH. That's been mission critical for WPATH, especially in the development of SOC 8, but even before.
So give them,
Um, what's that?
so it gives them credibility. If, oh
Right.
look,
Right. It makes them look like they are more a bona fide medical group rather than an activist group who's making recommendations for medical interventions based on whatever philosophical assumptions they happen to hold. But then the other thing that Cass mentioned, as you said, was that the circularity of citations. That WPATH cites Endocrine Society cites WPATH. And so that's rather than citing systematic reviews, they cite the authority of one another. So yeah, there are of course serious problems with the Endocrine Society guideline. But again, if you're looking at narrowly through the lens of deceptive practices related to commerce, which is the FTC's jurisdiction, it's not as clear to me that they have jurisdiction over the Endocrine Society. But I could be wrong. Again, I'm not a lawyer.
okay. How has WPATH responded to this lawsuit so far? Have they issued any statements or anything?
Yeah, they issued a statement. Was it the day of or the following day? I can't remember, but they issued a statement. It's exactly what you'd expect. They're saying gender affirming cares, evidence based care, life saving, this, that, and the other. Interestingly, they use the phrase evidence informed. I've never heard that term before. I don't know what evidence informed medicine is. That's like, what is it? Based on a true story versus based on true events or inspired by true events.
Yeah, it's like there's
Um, evidence informed medicine. Okay. But of course they're gonna, they're lawyered up now, right? So everything WPATH does publicly is going to go through their lawyers, and it's going to be legalistic. Um, one can assume, right? There could always be, wayward WPATH members going rogue, but that's kind of what. Oh, one thing I did want to mention, just it's not small, but it's also not huge. But that is on the question of the financial interests, and the hook that the FTC potentially has.
yeah.
Um, the conflict of interest was interesting because Marcy Bowers, for example, the former WPATH president who was heavily involved in the development of SOC 8, is a gender surgeon.
Didn't she make $1 million
And
a year doing this?
yeah, right. And Bowers admitted to making over $1 million in 2023 alone from gender surgeries. So, and Bowers was, of course, involved in the development of the surgery chapter. So to not declare that as a conflict of interest, I mean, and the same thing, by the way, with the incoming president, Lauren Schechter. Lauren Schechter is a gender surgeon, stands to benefit financially directly from recommendations for surgery and so forth. So to say that
Okay,
that's
right.
not a conflict of interest, I mean, come on.
Right. Um, well, I think we sort of touched on this. Let's say the FTC manages to argue successfully in court that does have jurisdiction, that this is a matter of commerce and consumer fraud, as it were, that
Mhm.
WPATH did, and this lawsuit succeeds. Then I do kind of wonder what is next for the other medical societies that have
Mhm.
gone along with this.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. It's a good question. Um, I
I mean,
wouldn't.
still
Yeah.
the
Go ahead.
puberty blockers, opposite sex hormones, and surgeries for gender confused young people.
It's possible, but I wouldn't bet on it. This is a field with deeply entrenched interests and unshakable ideological commitments. I don't see, even if WPATH were to go down in flames, whatever that means, I don't see that spelling the end. I mean, this is a field that is highly capable, as we've seen over the years, of kind of infiltrating institutions, capturing institutions, intimidating dissenters. I mean, I speak to doctors regularly who tell me I would love to be able to speak out, but if I do, I'm going to lose my livelihood. I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to alienate my colleagues. I won't be able to pay my medical school bills and so on and so forth. I mean, I've heard that story over and over and over and over again. And I don't blame them. On some level, I don't blame them. On some level, maybe I do, but in some level, I don't blame them because it's their livelihood. Um, but there is just, as Cass pointed out in her report, the debate is absolutely toxic. And that toxicity benefits those who defend these procedures because it just means that the doctors who know better, who see what's going on, who understand how this entire field of medicine has completely gone off the rails, um, they're deterred from speaking out. It's also a field, I should point out, that's extremely well organized and extremely well funded. You're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars have poured into transgender advocacy organizations from, donors like Mackenzie Scott, Jeff Bezos's former wife, um, who donated, I think it was $230 million for LGBT causes. And we know that LGBT causes today means, 90% of that means trans issues and specifically trans medicine. um, that contribution alone probably dwarfs all the money that is spent on organizations that are opposing gender transition for kids. So, and that's just one donor. I didn't even mention Pritzker and so forth. So there's just a huge amount of money here. And so my prediction would be that if WPATH were to go down in flames, let's say even kind of the ideal scenario for those who don't like WPATH would be something like the American Pain Society. which used to exist and now no longer does because it was disbanded when it was discovered that it had accepted money from Purdue Pharma and helped fuel the opioid epidemic.
Yeah.
That was a scandal that ended the American Pain Society. Um, Even if that happens to WPATH here, they're just going to regroup and rebrand, right? They're going to
Yeah.
reincorporate, call themselves the American Association for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine. And you'll see the same people making the same arguments, slightly repackaged. They'll probably pay lip service to the problems of the past and say, we have to be better, we have to be more honest with our patients and so forth. It's going to be more of the same. So until there's a kind of a full profession-wide reckoning, and I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, if at all. I think if this ends, this is going to end. It's not going to. First of all, it's not going to end completely. I think it's going to peter out to some extent. I think it's going to go the way of recovered memory and even lobotomy, which I'm told, I think reliably, still happens, despite
Really?
everybody's belief that it doesn't, on a very small scale, but it does.
Wow.
Recovered memory certainly happens, even though it's widely recognized that it was kind of the scandal of the 1980s and 1990s. And yet it's still practiced. And I think you're going to see the same thing here. I think you're going to see enclaves of kind of progressive America and deep blue states where gender clinics are still protected. They still operate. I don't think you're going to see the same scale of patients that we saw, let's say, in 2022, 2023, but you're definitely going to see this happening as a trickle, and parents are going to have to grapple with what that means. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, and this is so deeply politicized. I mean, all four states that joined the FTC in the lawsuit are Republican led, right?
Hmm.
The Texas, where the case is going to be heard, is Ken Paxton, who's
Hmm.
the embodiment of MAGA. I mean, he's now
Oh
running
yeah.
for Senate after winning the primary with the Trump endorsement.
Hmm.
Um, and then meantime, you've got these states that are led by Democrats who are suing the Trump administration over, Trump's attempts to exclude practitioners from federal programs of Medicaid, whatever, if they provide pediatric gender intervention. So
Hmm.
uh, this is not going to be like the Nordic countries where there's some sort of basic trust in a centralized authority, right?
Hmm.
This is just we're completely divided in two here. Um,
Yeah, and I'm working on, maybe we should end with this and open it up for questions, but I'm
yeah,
working on a long form essay that tries to explain why it is that the Democratic Party has been unable to change on this. Because we're seeing public opinion polls turn more and more against certainly pediatric gender transition, males and female sports. These are very, very unpopular positions, and they're increasingly unpopular even among Democrat voters and moderates, of course, but especially Republicans. But among Democrats, I think the New York Times poll last year found that, if I remember correctly, it was 54% of Democrat and Democrat leaning voters said
I
that
thought
puberty blockers should. What's that?
when they factored in the Democratic leaning voters, it was like 67%.
Yes, when you added
Oh, it
the
was
others to it.
4% for the
Yes.
gender, right? And then the sports was even more, right?
Well, the
Yeah.
sports was more. The sports is always more, but there was a slim majority of Democrat or Democrat leaning voters who said they did not support they did not support puberty blockers. So things have changed, and on the sports, it's even more lopsided. I mean, it's 2/3 of Democrat voters are against males and female sports, and I think, and I'll end with this, but um,
Whoop. I think we're having a technical issue. Whoop. Are you there?
yeah, I'm here.
Okay. I think we're hearing other voices.
Oh, okay, well,
Uh,
I'll
but
end with this. Yeah.
yeah. Uh, yes. So this is a very politically charged, topic,
Yeah,
and
and
look
I'll just end
forward
with
to
the example of Seth
yeah. Of
Moulton, the representative from Massachusetts,
course.
because I think it's very instructive. When Democrats lost in 2024, the presidential race, Moulton told the New York Times, I don't want my daughters having to compete against male athletes, and I should be able to say that. That shouldn't be taboo in Democratic circles to say that. It's common sense. He faced fierce backlash from transgender advocacy organizations in his state, and he has since walked that back. And
Well,
his
didn't his
position,
chief, the person who had led his campaign for reelection,
yeah,
quit in his. staff, his young staffers went, were up in
Right.
arms.
Exactly. Because their own careers are at stake here, right? And so he's since walked that back, and he was later asked, and in the context of a primary that he's launched against Ed Markey, who's very, very progressive, Seth Moulton is now at pains to show his agreement with transgender movement priorities. And that includes, for example, endorsing the Transgender Bill of Rights, the federal legislation that's been proposed. And that Bill of Rights would explicitly allow males to compete in female sports. So he has done a complete 180 after acknowledging what everybody knows that he knows.
Yes.
And he's basically putting on a show because he doesn't want to suffer electorally. He said, "I've listened, I've learned." Those were the words that he used. I don't think
Mm,
anybody buys that. I don't think anybody
mm.
buys that. But in any case, we can get into the kind of the structural features that make it very difficult for Democrats to moderate on this issue. But I think let's leave it there and open it up for
That's a
questions.
topic for another day. And boy, I'm really looking forward to reading your article. I hope it comes out soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Because that is the question that we're, all, banging our heads against the
Yeah.
walls. Let's go to some audience questions. I think Elliot's going to help us select.
Yes, thank you. Ben Ryan has been holding his hand up, as Ben does, for a long time. So, Ben, you get the first question, and if other people want to sort of line up, I will let you in. Ben, please go ahead. Oh, have we lost Ben?
You might have to designate him a speaker.
I
Yes.
did.
So
Well, he's been
here I am. Sorry,
Oh,
I'm
okay.
here. I was just like in a cell dead zone. Just I put some points of order in the thread if people want to look at them. Just that came up as Leor was talking. But my question is, and I wonder if there's an attorney online who could speak to this. So I'm going to read. There was a reference earlier to the case law that may or may not validate whether they consider to WPATH be engaging in commerce. So this guy, he was just on Twitter. He posted this, and this is Blue Sky. So I'm just going to read you what he said. He said the FTC's suit against WPATH will be dismissed before a court even reaches the obvious First Amendment questions, because the FTC Act applies only to commerce and thus applies to nonprofits only when they engage in commerce, which WPATH does not. The FTC relies on a 1999 Supreme Court decision, but omits the key details about that case. The California Dental Association was a 501c6 trade organization run by dentists, which provided insurance to its members through for-profit subsidiaries. So that bit about providing insurance, I think, is how that court case distinguished that they were indeed engaged in commerce, despite otherwise being fairly similar to it, at least ostensibly WPATH does. So I wonder if there's anyone, if it's Aaron or anyone else on the call, might want to speak to this case law and how you think it might impact the case, and especially impact the case considering which judge it's gone to in this particular district in Texas, at least for the first round.
So that dentist case, that's not the only basis for the court to have said that the dental society was engaged in commerce. Insurance was one aspect of it. Lobbying on behalf of the dental society was another factor. Providing discounted, I think it was discounted housing or something along those lines. But there were four reasons why the court said that it was commerce, and financial benefit to the dentists as part of the society was certainly one of those factors. So I think they're limiting that case. And there are a lot of cases. I mean, I did a Westlaw search on the number of times different societies were sued by the FTC, and it's a significant number. And it all is whether they are benefiting the membership. What I think WPATH did here in this milieu is they inserted themselves so many different times with their amicus briefs, with their statements, with pushing the fact that they are the experts, that they can't really disentangle themselves from being benefiting their members. There's also, I think, in the WPATH files, and sorry, it's been a while since I looked at it, but there's different discussions with WPATH members on how to ensure that they get insurance coverage, how best to get approval, how best to bill for this. So they have their hands are dirty. And I just also wanted to talk about the other societies because I think WPATH is the gorilla, but I think AAP for sure and the Endocrine Society secondarily are also really, they can be sued by the FTC also, because if they had stayed quiet, if they just said this is our guidance, then they would have been able to avoid an FT kind of look too. They are out there in front of this saying we are the guidance, we are the standards, we are the best, and all doctors should be.
Oops, did we lose Aaron? Go ahead.
So that was a great summary of the suit, Leor.
Thank you.
You're completely right. Endocrinologists and pediatricians are among the lowest paid of specialties. But there is a lot of money in this field, and I wonder about the drug companies and their involvement in all of this. Puberty blockers for 1 year in the United States cost about what a car does. And I'm wondering if the FTC is going to wonder about how WPATH is funded, because all these societies get money from the drug companies.
They do.
I don't know. I haven't seen evidence of that. I don't know. The fact that puberty blockers are being used off-label for this indication, and same for cross-sex hormones, actually provides the drug companies with a legal shield against liability. So, if they were to be used on label, they could potentially be on the hook. There's still some legal doctrines that you'd have to work through there. Because there's something called the intermediary doctrine, learned intermediary doctrine, which basically says that doctors are the discretion holders, and that to some extent absolves drug companies from liability here. But regardless, when you say there's a lot of money here, that it doesn't follow that the money goes primarily to the actual clinicians providing these treatments. It could go to clinics, hospitals, and so forth. So, yeah. So that's what I'd say about that.
All right, thanks.
Sure.
Are there other questions there, Elliot?
There are. Ben, did you have a follow-up
Yeah,
question there before I
I
move
guess I
on?
just one point that I did want to make that was, like, I think erroneous that someone said earlier, is that in the Fox variant detransitioner trial in White Plains in January, they didn't. The argument from the plaintiff's attorney was not that the defendants had violated the standards of care WPATH guidelines. In fact, they were never admitted into evidence, and the president, Lauren Schechter, the incoming president of WPATH, at least when it came to surgeries, said that the standards of care, capital S, capital C, were not the legal standard of care. Make of that what you will. So it was very difficult during the trial, which I attended in its entirety, for anyone to determine in what the standard of care was legally, because no one wanted to be pinned on it. So it remained a very vague concept during the trial.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ben. I recommend to anybody who hasn't read it, you should absolutely read Ben's coverage of that lawsuit. It's
Thanks.
a very interesting lawsuit, and it's somewhat different from the other detransitioner lawsuits that we've become accustomed to. Yeah.
I put links to the main View Press article I did in the thread, and there's the other thing about the Schechter. You can look at it if you want.
Great.
Thank you. That was my mistake. This is Martha. That was my mistake. I
No worries. I mean,
remember.
it's easy to make because it's so confusing. And
It
in
is
fact, the
confusing.
plaintiff's attorney, very wisely never even told the jury for a number of days that the guidelines were called the standards of care. He just called them the guidelines, which I thought just saved everybody a lot of headache.
Yes, it was very confusing. Was there anyone else? I think we have some. Anybody else, Elliot?
I had a question about that very thing, about the use of the document, Standard of Care 8. If the FTC is going to look at it as deceptive labeling, because that's really what the document amounts to, is a deceptive labeling of an entire industry, really. And so the very name Standard of Care implies a certainty of evidence. that it doesn't have, and they even denied the fact that it's a standard of care and call it a treatment guideline within the first pages of the document. So I just wondered if the FTC is going to treat the document like false labeling.
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I think the FTC does mention in its legal filing that they do tag this issue of that it's been that they've taken what amounts to a clinical guideline and they've called it the standard of care in a way that seems intended to deceive or at least to get neutral observers or judges to interpret it as something that it is not. But whether that is actionable, I don't know.
What kind of a timeline are we looking at? Do you have any idea? I mean,
I have
probably
no idea.
months and
I mean,
months.
yeah, oh yeah, at least this could, and of course the change of administration. If there's going to be a change of administration, if the Democrats resume office, and that might be one of the reasons that the state AGs joined to kind of give this a longer shelf life.
Right.
I don't know.
Right. Okay.
Let Dr. Roy come back in with another question. Dr. Roy, if you could step up to your microphone.
Oh, I just wanted to ask, what is the penalty of this if the FTC is successful in its lawsuit? Can it dissolve WPATH? Can it fine them?
So the remedies that the plaintiffs are seeking here are basically injunctions requiring WPATH to stop making, and they have the FTC complaint has a list of, I think it's like 10 specific types of misrepresentations, deceptive statements and stuff. And these are pretty comprehensive and, all inclusive. Saying things like, these medical interventions are known to be protective against suicide. That the mental health benefits are well established, that puberty blockers are reversible. So these are, pretty significant asks. And if the court, orders WPATH to stop making these representations, not just in SOC 8, but in its educational activities, it has that GEI, Global Educational Initiative, I think it's called. It does education for healthcare institutions and so forth. So if they are prohibited from making these representations, which I would argue, and I think most people on this call would agree, are false representations or at least unsubstantiated, that would neuter WPATH to such an extent that it would effectively be out of the game. It's hard to see what would be left of this organization if it was deprived of its ability to make these core claims about, or at least out of the game for pediatrics, I should say. Adults is a different issue, although there's plenty of stuff that they can go after on the adult front too, but they're not doing that here. Oh, well, one last thing I should say. The FTC can actually, in cooperation with the Department of Justice, can file criminal charges too. Can refer individual defendants for criminal charges. I'm not sure they're doing that in this lawsuit, but that could evolve. That could happen.
We'll have to see.
Yes.
Well, then we have to give a huge thank you to Dr. Leor Sapir for his meticulous dissection of this lawsuit, and look forward to your article, your autopsy of this of the Democratic Party going down this kind of suicidal path on this issue. Thank
you for having me on this. It's always a pleasure.
I just want to remind our listeners that if they would like to learn more about Democrats for an Informed Approach to Gender, you can go to our website, DIAG.org, and maybe you'd like to join us and help us lead our fellow liberals back to reason on these trans issues. So I thank you all for your attention, and a big thank you again to Dr. Sapir. I'm Martha Wexler. Have a good evening.